Welcome back to our final clue, clue number 6 of the 2021 Mystery Quilt. Make sure to consult your fabric key so that you cut from the right fabrics. From fabric A, you need to cut 2 strips that are 4.5 inches by the width of the fabric. From those strips, you will need to cut 12 squares that are 4.5 by 4.5. From fabric B, you will need to cut 2 strips that are 4.5 inches by the width of fabric. From those 2 strips, you will need to cut 13 squares that are 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches. Now it's time to get your binding strips ready to go. I cut my strips at 2.5 inches by the width of fabric. I will need 8 strips for my quilt because I'm making the larger size. If you are making the size without a border, you will only need 6 or 7. I am adding a border to my quilt, so my quilt will end up measuring 72 inches by 72 inches. I'm adding a 6.5 inch border, so I need to cut 8 strips that are 6.5 by the width of the fabric. Once I get these strips cut, I'm going to put my border strips and my binding strips in a bag and tuck them away so I don't accidentally cut them and use them for something else. And here is the final clue, step 6. These are the 2 blocks that you will be making. You will make 13 of block A and 12 of block B. Now all those separate pieces you made in the other clues start to make sense. And here is the finished diagram of the quilt. It's just 2 blocks alternated. I'm so happy with the way mine turned out, and I can't wait to see pictures of yours. You can either screenshot these pages or you can pause and take notes on the information that you need to continue making the quilt. So first we are going to work on block A. We will need the pieces that you just cut plus the pieces from clue 2 and clue 4. I like to get them out and arrange them on a table so that I know I'm putting them together properly and I've got everything turned the correct way. I've got my center square, and then I've got my pieces to make a square in a square, and I need to have my dark fabric in the corners. I'm making 3 rows. Since both the top row and the bottom row are the same, I'm only going to need to make 2 different kinds of rows, the middle row and the outer rows. You'll make 26 of the top row and 13 of the middle row. I've got them stacked up now. It's time to sew. Make sure you use a 1/4 inch seam allowance and double check your pieces that you are sewing them correctly as you send them through the sewing machine. Since this is the final step, it's going to take a little bit longer to sew these, so I've sped the sewing up a little bit. So have fun sewing and make sure you get your pieces to match the diagrams. Because of the way these are pressed, they should line up together and nest very nicely. Sometimes I would have to turn the quarter square triangle block unit 180 degrees to get the seam to go the other direction. Now that all the sections for block A have been sewn, I will get them lined up and set aside so that I can start on block B. I'll save my pressing for when I have all the pieces done for both blocks and press at the same time. It's now time to start working on block B. You'll need the squares you just cut and the pieces from clues 3 and 5. There are 3 different rows you'll be working on. The bottom and top row are the same, so you'll actually only have 2 different rows that you're working on. So pile up your pieces and start sewing. You will be making 12 of the center row and 24 of the bottom and top row. I am constantly checking my pieces to make sure I have them facing the correct way. I want to sew them together and not have to get my seam ripper out. Now that I have all the rows for both blocks put together, I can take all of it to the ironing board and press everything at once. For the center row of block A, press toward the center square. For the top and bottom rows of block A, you will want to press toward the half square triangle units on the corners. For the center of the block B units, press away from the center square. For the outer rows of block B, press toward the center. If you press these correctly at this stage, in the later stages, your blocks will fit together much better. Once you're done pressing, it's back to the sewing table. Get your rows put together and make sure you have them lined up correctly so they're all facing the correct way. Get them sewn together, 1/4 inch seams all the way. I like to pin my pieces together at this point because it will help me sew them together properly, and when you've pressed these correctly, the seams should nest together and make it really easy to sew, but the pins do help. Make sure to remove the pins before you sew over them. You don't want to cause any damage to your sewing machine. If you would like to press between each side, you certainly may. Please follow the pressing diagram on the pattern so that you are pressing in the correct direction. My personal preference is to just make all the blocks and press at the very end, so I'm just going to keep on sewing. Now that all my blocks are done, it's time to go back to the ironing board. For the block A blocks, press away from the center. For the block B blocks, press the seams toward the center row. Now it's time to start sewing the rows together. Set aside 3 of block A and 2 of block B, and then sew the rest in sets of 2, an A block to a B block. At this point, you will have 10 sets of 2 blocks. Take those 10 sets of 2 blocks and make 5 sets of 4 blocks. Now it's time to add in those blocks you set aside earlier. You will have 5 rows total, 3 with a block A on both ends, and 2 with a block B on both ends. Now it's time to press the rows. You will want to always press towards block A. I like to use a little bit of best press spray to help the blocks lay a little flatter. Now it's time to sew the rows together. If you have pressed correctly, a lot of these seams will nest together. I find it very helpful to pin at this point to make sure it's a little bit easier to sew. Once the rows are sewn together, press one last time before you quilt or add a border. I will press my seams all in one direction. If you are adding a border, now is the time to get the border ready and piece it end to end. Once the border is sewn together and pressed, measure the quilt top and cut 2 border pieces to match that measurement. Pin those borders to opposite sides of the quilt top. Start in the center and ends and pin carefully. If you pin, you will be less likely to stretch the border fabric and it will lay flat with no ripples. Once the first 2 seams are sewn on opposite sides, press towards the border fabric. Then measure the quilt top with the sides you just added to get a new measurement and cut 2 more border sections the length of that measurement. Once your borders are cut for the second round, pin carefully and sew them on opposite sides and press. And your quilt top is finished. Now that your quilt top is finished, you can hand quilt or machine quilt. I am going to machine quilt mine. After the quilt is quilted, trim the edges so you have raw edges all the way around and get your binding ready to sew on the edge of the quilt. I'm going to be using my diagonal seam tape to help me get straight lines when I'm sewing corner to corner on the binding strips. My seams are sewn, I'm going to trim the seams down to 1/4 inch and press the seams open. Finally, the binding is going on the quilt. If you need help with binding, please consult the Ultimate Binding Guide. If you've enjoyed this mystery, make sure you hit like and subscribe. I generally do not press my binding before I sew it onto my quilt top. I like to press it at the end after it's already sewn on. Now the binding is ready to hand stitch to the back or machine top stitch from the front. I will get my binding clips out, put the fabric around the edge of the quilt, and top stitch from the front. I will sew in the ditch to catch the fabric on the back. The clips really help hold the binding in place until I get to it. I really like the way that this method looks when it's finished. It's very close to the edge and there's no hand stitching. And a lot of people think I've actually done the stitching by hand because they can't see the stitching in the ditch. So, bonus for me. Now my quilt top is done and the binding is sewn on, it's time to label the quilt. You can make a separate label or just write on the back of the quilt. I have a lot of white space in this quilt, so that's what I'm going to do this time around. Include your name, the name of the quilt, the year it was made, and anything interesting about the quilt that you want to remember in the future. And here's my finished quilt. I quilted it with a meander or stipple type of quilting. I didn't want to do anything too fussy or heavy. I love the border I added. It turned out exactly the way I wanted it to. As promised, here is an alternate colorway. This was my first testing of the pattern. I used batiks in blues and burgundy and the light background color. And I did some fancy quilting in the blocks for this one. I really love the way this one turned out. I did not add a border to this one. Look for our bonus project made using the half square triangles that were left over in some of the blocks from this quilt. Thank you so much for watching. We hope you enjoy your quilt and happy quilting.